So, assess and improve your digital activities with the focus of working through the digital culture compass. So, this is a quick outline of the day. We've already done the introductions, ignore the 10:30 start. We're going to have a little focus on digital strategy and museum missions. I'm not expecting everybody to have a digital strategy, but I think it's going to be important for us to sort of discuss what a digital strategy is, and maybe think a little bit about how we can strategically use digital, and that can really help when it comes to assessing the activities that you're doing and the reasons behind them. Then I'm going to give you a quick overview of the digital culture compass. Then we'll have a break. And then we've got the Museum of Freemasonry giving us their case study. Then we're going to have a look at completing a section of the compass altogether, the marketing and communications activity. We'll have a little roundup of that, how people found it, any questions or issues that they might have. And then we're going to let you all focus on one area of your choice. So you can, we'll be doing those in Zoom groups as well. I'll break you into 3 different groups so you can talk to each other and discuss ideas, that sort of stuff. And then again, we'll have a roundup, and then we're going to have a quick look at the report that you get once you've completed different sections of the compass. Hopefully, a lot of this will make a lot more sense as we go through. So what is a digital strategy? A digital strategy isn't overly different to any other kind of strategy. Really, digital is a tool that you use to achieve, different things. Similarly to how you might have like an audience engagement strategy, how you might have a collections strategy. Digital isn't different. It's just a different tool for achieving your objectives and aims, and that's why we talk about being strategic behind your use of digital. And because as you're going to see when we get to the digital culture compass, there's loads of different activity areas that have some form of digital within them, and you can't do them all necessarily, but what you can do is be strategic and focused about the different types of digital tools or platforms or activities that you do to make sure that you're achieving what your museum is setting out to do. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a sec. So if you're looking for a good overview of what a strategy is, a really good book is Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rumel. And you can get that on Amazon for like £7. It's a really good read, particularly if you're thinking more about strategy and how you can be strategic in your work. It doesn't focus directly on digital, but again, a digital strategy isn't overly different to any other kind of strategy. So it is a good book to check out. So he summarizes it as a cohesive response to an important challenge. But I've also put in brackets or opportunity, because whilst there's lots of things that are challenging at the moment for museums, there are also lots of opportunities. And I think we've seen that digital, particularly at the moment, can very much be an opportunity for doing what you have been doing in person, but in a sort of slightly different, slightly more challenging, but again, a bit more of an opportunity there. A good strategy focuses on making the best use of limited resources, and I think it's particularly when we're looking at the culture compass, is important to think of not necessarily limited resources, but just to think of the context of your resources. So an organization like the British Museum, which is huge and very well funded, is going to be very different to a small museum. But it doesn't mean that you can't still do digital activities within your own context. And we'll be talking about that context a little bit later. It's a set of goals, ideals, or objectives that you'd like to achieve through digital activities. And before this session started, a week or so ago, I did send out a little activity sheet, which was looking at digital strategy. You didn't have to do that. There was, no need to complete it before the session, but if you did do it, hopefully it sort of helped frame your thinking around how you're using digital within your organization and thinking about some of those goals or objectives that you might be hoping to achieve through your use of digital. So I have one. You don't need a digital strategy, and there's plenty of organizations that function incredibly well without one. But the benefits of having a digital strategy is that it can help you focus limited resources. It can ensure that you're using all of the tools available to achieve your mission. And there's loads of different tools out there for loads of different types of activities. So a strategy can very much help you focus in on what is going to be most useful and what is going to be most impactful for your organization and also your audiences. And I think one of the most key things about a digital strategy is knowing what success looks like. Because you can spend ages looking at your digital activities and assessing them, but if you're not assessing them against a specific set of desired goals or achievements, it can be difficult to know what success is. So having a strategy that sort of outlines what success is can give you something to work towards when you are looking at your activities, understanding what you're doing and trying to improve on them. So I thought I'd give you a quick example from the Museum of London on how you can align digital activities with your mission. So the Museum of London, our strategic aims is to reach more people, become better known, stretch thinking, engage every school child, and stand on our own 2 feet. Those are like the things that the Museum of London is trying to achieve with everything that they do, digital and non-digital. So I'm just going to take one of those and I'm going to focus on engage every school child. So without digital activities, there's no way that the Museum of London could engage every school child. And this is in London, not every school child in the world. They're not crazy. But yeah, how could they engage every school child in London without the use of digital? It's just not possible. There's a lot of school kids in London and not enough space at the museum or days in the year. So digital really is a key part of that strategic aim. So when you're thinking about digital activities that will help to achieve these aims, we do things like live streams for schools using YouTube and Facebook. And when I send out the link, the slides, you've got the links to it there. And we create digital resources for teachers, including a really useful early years toolkit, which is designed to help teachers to engage their pupils with the subject matter of the museum. And then they also do physical in-house activities, obviously not at the moment, but historically they have. And within those activities, they've used digital tools and apps and digital activities to be part of those physical activities. So things like stop motion animations. They've made lots of really great stop motion animations with school kids using various different collection items. So hopefully you can see there how you can have, an aim or an objective. So that aim or objective being engage every school child, which is quite broad. And then how digital can feed into that as part of how you achieve that. So for the Museum of London, obviously it's digital activities aimed at engaging school kids, but within all of these different aims and objectives, digital will play a role. So this isn't something that you need to do right now, but at some point, I think this is quite a helpful activity, and it's probably something that you want to be doing with multiple members of staff, even your sort of senior leaders. Thinking about the digital activities that you do currently do. So taking a period of reflection, and the Culture Compass can be really helpful for that because it lays out the different kinds of digital activities really effectively. And then think about how the activities that you're doing at the moment help you to achieve those goals, missions, aims of your organization. Again, you don't have to have a digital strategy in place to do this sort of work. And I think it's also important to think about it directly and indirectly. So obviously for the Museum of London, there's thinking about that engaging every school child. The live streams and that sort of stuff are directly impacting and helping to achieve that goal. But then there's loads of digital that goes on in the background that indirectly helps. Things like all the way down to like ICT, having the ICT department there to help support the organization with the purchase of technologies that can help them achieve those sorts of aims. And again, when we look at the Culture Compass, you'll see that digital is all encompassing. And and that it is just sort of like aspects of different areas of your organization that use digital in different ways. I think quite often there's when we think of digital, quite often automatically we think of digital engagement, like audience engagement. And obviously that's a key core part of digital, particularly at the moment with the internet and social media. But it is just one piece of a much wider puzzle of where digital, fits into your daily work and how your organization functions. And then, so sort of carrying on after that sort of review process, thinking about what digital activities best align with the goals, missions, and aims of your organization. And then once you've done that sort of work, you can then start thinking about whether or not you need a document that outlines your approach, a digital strategy. In a sense, it could be, absolutely massive, and it could have pages and pages of information. Equally, it could just be a statement that says, we will use digital in X ways to achieve, Y things. Is everybody happy with that? Cool. So yeah, I've already sort of mentioned this, but I think it's important to reiterate that digital activities take many forms, and they aren't just audience facing. Consider all aspects of your digital work and how those activities impact on your organization's aims and objectives, both directly and indirectly. And that's why I say that this could be a useful thing to do as a group, as Louise is going to talk about a little bit later, because there's going to be lots of areas of your organization and how it works, even in very small teams, where you won't necessarily know all of the different digital activities that take place. And you may also not be in a position to, make those strategic aims and objectives. You can obviously, advise and feed in from your own experience, but sometimes it's the senior leadership that needs to, come up with that sort of those aims and objectives. And then it's sort of down to you almost to connect the dots between digital and the things that your organization wants to achieve. So that was a crash course in digital strategy. I'm not expecting you now to be able to just, go off and write yourself a digital strategy. But hopefully that's sort of given you a bit of a taste as to the sorts of things that you need to be thinking about. And also, if you use that in conjunction with the activity sheet that I sent out, hopefully that will also help structure your thinking a little bit. This session isn't about building a digital strategy. We may do something along those lines at a later date. This session is focusing on looking at your digital activities. But if you are in a position where you're thinking about creating a digital strategy or editing a digital strategy, this toolkit will be really helpful in structuring your thinking. So, what is the Digital Culture Compass? I stole this off of their website because I figure if anybody knows, it will be them. The Digital Culture Compass is an online toolkit to support arts, culture, and heritage organizations to integrate digital technology into their work. It has two elements. We're going to be focusing on the tracker, but the charter outlines digital best practices, which is a really useful thing to check out because it has some really interesting sort of thoughts and concepts around how digital can be used within an organization, particularly within an arts, culture, and heritage organization. So definitely check that out. And then the tracker, which is what we're going to be focusing on, it allows organizations to assess their approach to digital technology and develop plans for the future. So to sort of break that down a little bit, it's a helpful tool for developing and refreshing a digital strategy, which I think Louise might touch upon a little bit when she does her case study in a bit. But you don't need a digital strategy in place for the compass to be useful, because it is basically just looking at your digital activities and assessing how successful you are based on a criteria that has been predefined by the Culture Compass. It's a big toolkit, so this session is going to be giving you an introduction. We're not going to be completing the whole compass, and I'm sure you'll see why once we get started on the first activity. The tracker element of the compass allows you to assess your organization's current use of digital within 12 key activity areas, and I've outlined those activity areas on the next slide. It allows you to set targets for where you'd like to be in the next 12 months as well, so it gives you an overview of where you're currently at, and then allows you to set targets for where you want to be in the next year. You can also record notes that explain the thinking behind your current assessment and targets. And I think that's a really important thing to point out. When we start looking at the compass, you'll probably see what I mean. But having some notes explaining the reasoning behind your decision to rate, one thing a 1 and another thing a 2, can be really useful over the year when you then come to look back at it, because there's a good chance that you might forget why you rated something so low when what you're doing now is much better. You can sort of forget about that original context when you sort of travel from point A to point C. So having those notes when you complete the compass can be a really good thing to just sort of check back on and to understand how your thinking and your activities have changed over the past year. So I think that's an important thing to point out. It also lets you create a report which you can share online with colleagues and others, which is really handy, particularly if at the moment you're thinking of doing this as an activity with multiple members of your staff. Hopefully once we get going with the compass, you can see how you could potentially do this as a group on Zoom, working through different activities. I'll say that this activity is best done with as many members of staff from your organization as possible, and with as many members of staff from different levels of your organization, from senior leaders to practitioners. It's really helpful to have all of those different perspectives when you're completing the compass, because you'll be looking at it from your own point of view with your own role or work in mind. But a director will have a much different concept of how digital can be used within the organization to somebody who is running the social media, because you're always looking at it through your specific lens. So the more people involved, the better, within reason. I'm not saying have like a Zoom call of 150 people or something ridiculous like that. Maybe like groups of 10 as a max would probably be quite handy. So here are the activity areas. And within each activity area, there's a number of questions which sort of break down into further activities that you might be doing within that activity. And you can then grade those as well. And I think it's important to say that not every one of these activity areas will be relevant for your organization. Louise will talk a little bit more about that, but there might be some organizations where they have external HR or external IT support, which you don't have any control over, so you can ignore those. That's the great thing about the compass, is you can focus on all of the activity areas or just some specific ones, and we'll see how that works in a minute. Yeah, so again, there's within the compass there's a description of what each activity entails. But maybe have a quick look through this list, or have a quick look at the website if you want, and think about some of the areas that you might like to focus on later on. So the way that it's scored from 0 to 2. So 0 meaning not doing, and 2 meaning pretty much doing, or actually doing, and then there's a 1 in the middle, which means like the halfway house, we're working towards it kind of thing. And then and you score each maturity level. So you can see the maturity levels at the bottom there: initial, managed, integrated, optimizing, and transforming. Now you could it could be easy to think of it as level 1 initial being really basic, and level 5 transforming being all singing or dancing. And in some cases that is the case, but there is the potential to score, let's say, a 2 on initial, which is really good, a 1 on managed, which isn't too bad, and then you could give yourself a 2 on integrated again, which is really good. So basically what I'm trying to say is that you can be different levels of maturity within the same activity, and hopefully you'll be able to see what I mean by that in a second when we move on to looking at the compass real quick. The one thing that I will say is that the most important thing is to be consistent with your scoring, and this is something that's come out through conversations with Louise, is that at the end of the day, it doesn't overly matter what you score. You're not necessarily putting all of this information into a big database that's then aggregated and compared to other organizations. And this is very much an internal document and an internal activity that will give you a score based on what you deem, your organization to be. But if you're consistent with your understanding of how you're scoring it and the levels that you're scoring it at, it'll be a much more useful exercise. So even if you don't necessarily score it correctly, whatever that means, as long as you understand why you've scored it as such, it will still be useful for your organization, and it will still be a useful activity. So, and it's also important that you understand the context of how you scored things. So if you're comparing, so when you're going through the activities, let's say, and we'll take marketing and comms, for instance. If you're looking at it and you're thinking, well, the British Museum does this and the British Museum does that, and the British Museum, is the gold standard, that's a 2. We're just a tiny museum. We'll never have that. We'll never have their funding. We'll never have a dedicated marketing communications person. So we're going to be 0s and 1s. I wouldn't score it that way, but if that's the way that you want to do it, that's fine. You just need to be consistent in it. So when you then go on to the next activity area, you need to be comparing yourself to the large organizations. The way that I would do it, and that I think I would find more useful, would be to score it within the context of your organization. So if it was a fantastic day and you managed to get, heritage funding for a project and everything went swimmingly perfect, that would be a 2. It's never going to be as good as the museum that gets, millions and millions of pounds from the government. But within the context of your organization, that was a really good example of a digital activity. And I think that would be much more valuable for you when you go through the toolkit, because you'll be understanding it from the context of your own organization and the context of the activities that you currently do, as opposed to comparing yourself to something that in reality isn't achievable. So what we're going to do real quick now is have a look at the first question for the marketing and communications area of the compass. So I'll just scroll to the top. So if you've not had a chance yet, at some point go to digitalculturecompass.org.uk, and you'll want to register an account. It doesn't take long, but once you've done it, that means that you can complete one of these reports. So this gives you an overview of all of the different activities within the tracker, so you can find it there. Once you've logged in, you go to tracker, and then you go to create assessment. This is an assessment that I've already started. And these are all of the different activity areas that you can choose. And as you can see, these are all grayed out, and it's because I've selected them as not applicable. But as soon as you tick that, it then means you can start filling out all of the questions. And the other good thing is that you can also gray out specific questions. So there might be sort of activity areas within each activity that aren't relevant, but some that are. So you can cross out the ones that aren't and include the ones that are. For now, we're just going to look at marketing and communications, because this is the one that we're going to go through together before we then let you go and do the area that you fancy. So as you can see, I've already started, I've already completed this so that we could have a report that we could look at the end of the session. But we've got here marketing and communications. So the overview is reaching, communicating, engaging, and building relationships with target groups, including audiences, visitors, and other important stakeholders to achieve your objectives, including income generation. So the first question, reaching target groups. Now the compass breaks down what they mean by each activity. And they also break down some of the things that you need to consider when you're thinking about this activity. The one thing that I will say is, again, this compass has been created for the arts and culture and heritage sector. It's not been created specifically for museums. So you might find that there's some language in here or some wording that you wouldn't necessarily find within a museum context. So it might take you a little bit longer, but it is worth properly reading through what they mean by each activity and thinking about how that relates to a museum context. So looking at this question, what we mean by this activity: identifying, prioritizing, and communicating with different groups of people using your communication channels. Groups might include types of audiences or visitors, but it can also include volunteers, members, donors, suppliers, partners, and others very important to your success. So basically, by target groups, they mean any audience within any context that you are communicating with through your different channels. So different channels include things like your social media, your website, email marketing, but it can also include digital aspects of more traditional forms of marketing as well. So if you do like leaflets, there is a sort of like digital aspect in the design of those leaflets. So you could theoretically include that as well. But thinking about target groups specifically, they've also got here things to consider when you're answering that question. And now we come on to the maturity levels. So we've got initial, managed, integrated, optimizing, and transforming. And then along the right here, the blue is the level that you're currently at, and the green is the level that you want to be in 12 months. So at the moment, for this question, I've got a current total of 3 and a 12-month target of 6. And that's because I've rated initials to managed as 1, 0, 0, 0. And then in the future, I want it to be 2, 2, 1, 1, 0. At the moment, that doesn't mean much, but you can see that then if I was to change this to 1, that will then go down to 2. So it sort of gives you an aggregate for each individual question. And in the marketing one, I think there's 8 questions. So 5.2, 5.3, yeah. And you can go through, answer each question. And then at the bottom here, this is where you can add your notes. So I did this fairly quickly just so that we'd have a report, but I just put something along the lines of, we're working towards having a more data-based approach to our digital work and reaching our target audiences, but at the moment we're not doing enough to fully understand where our target audiences are and what they want from us. This is just complete gobbledygook in a way. I'm not actually doing this for the Museum of London or anything. This is just for an example. And then target score notes. We want to be in a position where we can use data to better understand our audiences and to better reach target audiences. But hopefully you can understand what I mean by the importance of having those notes, because if you were to complete, all 8 questions, leave it for 12 months and then come back to it at the end of the year and be like, okay, let's see, how we've done, and then compare it just based off of those numbers, you could see that it could be quite vague. You might not be able to fully understand the position that you were in when you started compared to the position that you're in now. And you might not be able to understand the sort of like slight intricacies that have happened and the changes that have happened over 12 months that have got you to the position that you're currently in compared to the position that you were in when you started. So having these notes can be really useful to just give you an idea of where you are when you did it today, and then where you are when you look at it in 12 months' time. And again, just because it says 12 months doesn't mean that you can only look at it at the end of 12 months. Can everybody hear me okay? Cool. So basically what I was getting at is having those notes is just really handy for understanding where you were to where you are now. But now looking at each individual question. So the initial, managed, integrated, optimizing, and transforming has a little bit of text underneath it to help you sort of understand whether or not you're meeting that criteria. And the text is different for each question. So this is the text for initial on question 1. But then if we went to question 2, you can see that the text is different because the context of the activity is slightly different. But focusing on question 1, we've got, we have digital elements happening in our marketing / communications to reach target groups, or we can when we need to. E.g., we have a basic newsletter system, we have social media channels, we use mail merge to reach target groups. I'd imagine that the vast majority of you are probably scoring a 1 or a 2 here, because you will have a website, most likely you will have social media platforms. Maybe you'll do some email marketing. For initial, you just have to do sort of aspects of 1 or multiple ones of those. So that's why I gave myself a 2. And then for initial in 12 months, I'd expect that we're either at the same or, we're doing more, but there's no 3. So we'll go for 2 again. Then we move to managed. We have a marketing communications plan covering digital activities that is periodically reviewed and appropriate to our organization. This plan considers who our target audiences are, what digital channels and content we will use to reach them, and for what purpose. So in my made up Museum of Alec, I've decided that we don't have a formal communications plan or formal social media strategy, but we do have an idea of how we want to use social media to achieve our organization's aims and objectives and to reach those audiences. So I've scored it a 1 because I know that the work has sort of started and I know that we're nearly there, but we haven't reached the final, here's the document sort of thing. So I'll put that as a 1 for now. And then the 2 will be, at the end of the year, we'll have a social media strategy and we will have done the work to create that document, which aligns all of our thinking and all of our use of social media. Then we've got integrated, specific measurable objectives for our digital marketing communications activities, and they are effective in delivering our organization's wider strategy. And I think that is sort of the key here, effective in delivering our organization's wider strategy. And it's also saying measurable objectives for our digital marketing communications. So as I said, with the managed question in my fictitious museum, we know what we're doing and we know what we're working towards. We just don't have it in a document per se. Whereas integrated is basically saying we have that document. So, and that it's being effective in delivering our organization's wider strategy. So there's no way that I could score that as a 1 or a 2 because we don't have that document. And because we don't, there's no real way of knowing whether or not it's effective in delivering our wider strategy. So I've scored that as a 0. But in the next 12 months, I know that we're going to have a social media strategy because I've said that in managed. But we're not 100% sure how that is going to be effective in delivering our organization's wider strategy, because we won't be in a position yet to have acted on that strategy. So I've done that as a 1, basically to say that we want to be in a position where we're working towards this, but not quite there. And then maybe in another 12 months or another 2 years, we'll be in a position to mark that as a 1 and this as a 2, or both as a 2 potentially. Optimizing. So now you can see how potentially you could score higher on a higher maturity level. So we systematically gather and analyze evidence of the effectiveness of both our digital and non-digital marketing communication activities in reaching target groups using appropriate metrics. So theoretically, I could be working without a specific strategy, and I could be working without specific measurable goals, but I could be spending time collecting all of our social media analytics data and looking at how our audiences are using our content and interacting with our platforms, and then sort of making decisions based on the information that I'm gathering. I could do that without a strategy. That's something that you can theoretically do. So you could, if you wanted to, mark that as a 1, and this is a 2. And then in your mind, you'd be thinking, okay, so at the moment I'm doing this work of gathering all of this data, but I don't have a wider strategy as to how I want to implement that data to make sure that we're achieving the museum's goals and aims. So that's something that you would then use within your social media strategy, for instance. You'd link the 2 together. At the moment, they're not linked because one doesn't exist in my fictional Museum of Alec. But I am doing the optimizing in a sense. So can you see how there's a little bit of a, just because it's maturity levels 1 to 5 doesn't mean that you can't be scoring higher on a 4 than you are on a 2. And then finally, we've got transforming. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think anybody should necessarily be scoring themselves many transformings, because basically it's always the same sentence or similar. We are using digital to reach target groups in order to support significant innovation or substantial strategic change. But this does come back to what I was saying about looking at it within the context of your organization. So The VNA will be using digital to reach groups and there's a good chance that they'll be using it to support significant or some sort of innovation or to have some sort of strategic change within their organization. But the VNA is reaching millions of people from across the globe. A much smaller museum, you could never really dream of reaching VNA numbers because you don't have the funding and the resources behind an organization of that size. So if you were looking at the VNA thinking that's transforming, that's doing the transformative work, you would probably be scoring yourself zeros on this because you're like, well, there's no way that we're ever going to have their resources and their ability to reach those sorts of audiences. But if you think of it within the context of your own organization, and if you say that we worked really hard to reach an underrepresented audience within our organization who don't usually engage with the museum, but we managed to get them engaging, and because of that we changed the way that our organization works to make sure that we're more inclusive for different audiences. When you compare it to how you were working before, you could potentially say that that's transformative for your organization, even though it's a small group and it's not on the scale of a national. It is still transformative for you and for your organization. So I think don't be afraid to think of the work that you're doing as transformative for your own context, but also don't get complacent and be like, yeah, we're doing amazing and just scored 2 for everything, because again, that's not helpful either. I think we're going to take a break because that's a lot of information. We've just gone through one question. What we're going to do a little bit later, after the case study from the Museum of Freemasonry, we're going to carry on going through some of the questions in the marketing and communications section. We're not going to do them all because there's not going to be enough time, but we will look at them in some detail. And then after that, we'll have one more break. And then you can decide whether you want to, within your Zoom groups, carry on going through the marketing and communications thing, or relook over it and answer it for yourself, or you could choose a different activity area. And then myself and Louise, we're going to sort of like jump in through the groups and help out where possible. We're going to have the case study now from the Museum of Freemasonry. So Louise is going to take it away.
Hi everyone. I'm Louise Pichel and I'm the Assistant Archivist at the Museum of Freemasonry. We're based in Freemasons Hall, Covent Garden in London, which is a beautiful Art Deco building in its own right. And our collections include objects, books and archives on all aspects of Freemasonry from all over the world over the last 300 years or so. Our purpose is to help people learn about Freemasonry through our collections, and we do this through a varied public programme including exhibitions, guided and curator-led tours and talks and workshops. I'm here to talk through the process of how we used the Culture Compass to help us to understand how we could use digital to improve how we do the job we do. I'll then hand over to our director, Vicky Carroll, who will be talking about the experience from a wider strategic point of view. So the first question is, why did we do the Culture Compass? Museum of Freemasonry is in the process of developing our digital strategy. We've been working quite hard on getting people through the doors to look at the collections on site, but we've realised that there could be more that we could be doing to serve our online audiences and enhance our on-site offering using digital. As part of this strategy work, we needed to get a handle on the current state of our digital activities. We've dipped our toes in with a few specific projects over the years, interactives in a redesigned gallery, introducing audio guides, that sort of thing. But these were very much one-time projects rather than a long-term commitment to digital. Fast forward several years and a complete rebrand, including a new website and an embedded consistent brand identity, has propelled us into the 21st century. And as a result, we've started doing a couple of key things radically differently. And by that, I mean digitally, most noticeably in our marketing and communications work. But there were many other areas where we either don't use digital at all or could be using it more effectively. We needed some sort of written evidence as to where we were to use as a baseline for planning where we wanted to go next, which would come in handy for doing our digital strategy and the action plan. The Digital Culture Compass looked like the sort of tool we needed to work out where we were and to give us an idea of how we might improve. So the next question is how we did it. Ideally, we would have had some on-site workshops with all members of staff, with copious amounts of post-its and biscuits for bribery, where we all worked through the compass questions and scoring in a controlled and methodical way, but COVID had other ideas. And in the end, I ended up arranging 2 video meetings, inviting particular colleagues based on the specific sections we were looking to cover in each meeting. And it's worth saying here that we didn't attempt to cover all sections of the compass. As Alec mentioned in his introduction, there were some elements that we worked out that weren't relevant to us, as we didn't have control over them. So for us, it was finance, HR, and IT, because it's all managed by our parent organisation. And there were some aspects that needed to be considered in more detail by the director and the trustees, so we left them until a later date. Before the meetings, I downloaded the spreadsheet of tracker questions, as well as the tracker online. You can download them as a spreadsheet. And I asked staff how to consider, or I asked staff to consider how they might score our progress in the various areas. Now, as I say, this isn't something I'd normally do, or I would have done in a normal work situation. I would never normally resort to a spreadsheet if I can help it, because most people are terrified of them. There was a fair bit of initial confusion over how to use it, but once I'd circulated the guidance from the website, the Culture Compass website, people got the hang of it. I also arranged for a pre-meeting meeting, love those, to go through immediate queries that people had, and to introduce the compass and how the scoring worked, a bit like Alec did at the start of the meeting here. After this, colleagues were able to come to the meeting armed with an idea of the scoring, and we worked through the sections we aimed to cover, and we discussed where we thought we were with the scoring for the different maturity levels. In the process of working through the sections, we did have to take some time to understand some of the examples, as they didn't look to be immediately relevant. This particularly came up in the programme section, where the examples seemed to be focused on theatres or other performance spaces rather than museums. This didn't mean that the questions weren't relevant. It just meant that we had to make more of an effort to keep our particular context in mind, as Alec was saying earlier. The compass was developed to try and be as relevant as possible to all types of cultural organisation, but inevitably it's only partially successful at this. The descriptions of the maturity levels prompted some discussion as well. Different members of the team had different ideas about what the different levels meant. Transformative was particularly interesting, as it could be defined as transformative to the sector as well as transformative to the organisation. We chose to score ourselves against the definition as transformative to the organisation. So the idea was that what we were doing was a complete steps change from where we'd been before, rather than scoring against whether it was transformative to the wider museum sector, which was less relevant to us. This made for high scoring in some areas where we'd made big strides in recent years, so marketing and communications in particular for us, and demonstrated the work that had been done to drastically change and improve our working practices using digital tools. The other point to make about scoring is that we also stumbled occasionally when we realised that we had high scores for high levels and low scores for lower levels. It's pretty similar to what Alec was explaining earlier, really, but we had some high scoring in the initial level, so we were using stuff and doing it in a basic way, and we were using it to contribute to strategy in the data that we were pulling together was, was making a difference to our strategy. So we were scoring highly in the optimizing level, but because there was no sort of plan in place to make sure that stuff was being monitored on a regular basis and evaluated, we ended up with a lower score at the integrated level. And that's perfectly okay. It's just something that you need to be aware of when you're working through the scoring. Once we completed the spreadsheet as far as we wanted to, and we included both current and target scoring in this, I plugged the numbers into the online tracker and generated a report showing where our gaps are. These gaps have provided a starting point for targeting our digital strategy towards areas where we'd like to make the most improvement. The intention is for us to do the exercise again in a year's time or so to see how we've got on. And as the digital strategy work develops, when it comes to reviewing the tracker, I'm hopeful that we'll have made some decent steps in the right direction. That's the nuts and bolts of how we did it. So here are my top tips for anybody looking to do this themselves. My top tip would be, ideally, don't do it over a video conference, although it is possible, and it's definitely more possible than I thought it was, because there are all sorts of collaborative tools available. And it was the Museum of London Digital Chat event with Alec that pointed me towards things like Google Jamboards and using Google Documents for collaborative thinking, that sort of thing. So I would definitely do things a little bit more differently now if I was doing it, and be using sort of collaborative tools to supplement Zoom rooms and that sort of thing. Apologies if you can hear some background noise as well. I've got some builders in next door, which is terribly helpful right now. Make sure that you involve everybody in the team as far as you can. It really helped to get feedback from everybody in the team, and they were even feeding back on areas where they thought they didn't have anything to contribute. So that helped to build a full picture of everyone's roles and how everything kind of fits together. Listen to everybody. So it sounds obvious, but don't assume that you know everything about everyone's job. Ask lots of follow-up questions if you can, and this helps people to realise that they're probably doing a bit more than they think they are in terms of their digital work. Keep your particular context in mind. So it does take a bit of effort, but if you keep your organisation and how you do things in your head as you work through the questions, things will be easier. Some bits may not seem relevant at first glance, but we found that with a bit of thought and conversation, things became clearer. Last point is to review your progress. So don't just do the digital culture compass and walk away. It's not just a tick box to say you're doing digital. It needs to be part of a wider commitment to integrating digital into your organisation. And you need to be able to review and evaluate progress on the tracker on an ongoing basis. Now you've got an idea of how it works on a practical level, I'll hand over to our director, Vicky Carroll, who has some thoughts on the broader strategic angle.
Hello everyone, I'm Vicky Carroll. I've been the director of Museum of Freemasonry for 2.5 years. And as Louise touched on, one of our strategic priorities is to grow and diversify our audience. Up until now, our focus has been on our physical audience, and we've used digital technology successfully to raise awareness of the museum and drive footfall. This year, I wanted to look more broadly and systematically at how we can use digital to support all of our strategic aims. I concluded that we needed a digital strategy which would mesh with our overall, overarching organisational strategy. And whilst I was thinking about how to go about this, I went to a presentation about the digital culture compass, and I thought that might be a good way to kick the process off. So I put together the bones of a project plan, and I fleshed this out with Louise. And I asked Louise to manage the project because although it's not an obvious part of an assistant archivist role, I know that Louise is passionate about digital technology and has a lot of expertise in this area, and I thought that that would be a good opportunity for her, as well as a great opportunity for the museum. The Digital Culture Compass is a systematic way of shining light on each area of your business and asking, how do we use digital technology here, right now, and how might we do things differently in the future? I found it to be a really great way of starting a conversation about digital with my team. So we're a team of 20 people at Museum of Freemasonry, and like most organisations, some staff are more digitally confident than others. When Louise brought together groups of people from different specialist areas to work through the compass, one thing that struck me was that everybody had something to contribute, even those staff who perhaps didn't define themselves as being digitally confident. Often valuable observations came and ideas came from people who didn't necessarily work directly in the area under scrutiny. And one thing that's quite nice about working with a framework is that it gives people license to do that, to comment on other areas of activity without feeling like they might be treading on somebody else's toes or being critical. The focus of our meetings was on the first part of the compass, so it was on scoring where we are now. But what I noticed is that the team also began to problem solve and come up with ideas and to start to think about things we could be doing in the future in the process of doing that evaluation. To me, those conversations were at least as valuable, if not perhaps more valuable, than the scores that came out in the end. Louise did a really great job of minuting those conversations. And so my top tip here really would be to make sure that somebody, perhaps not the person that's also going to chair the sessions, but to make sure that somebody is recording the conversations, either literally recording the Zoom calls or making really good notes. And you're not just focusing entirely on the scores. One benefit of having a framework like this is that it makes you look at areas you might not have thought of. So, for example, we've done a lot recently around digital marketing and communication. And that means it's actually quite easy to think of yet more things we could do in that area to promote the museum. But what we found when we went through the compass is that, for example, we hadn't really paid enough systematic attention to how we could use digital technology to improve access to the museum for people with disabilities. And so since discovering that, we've had some quick wins already. So, for example, we've just launched a series of video talks, and the team's very quick to make sure that those talks are properly subtitled on the videos. But then we'll be addressing the issue of accessibility more systematically as we develop our digital strategy. As you've probably gathered by now, that the Digital Culture Compass is very comprehensive, and that's one of its strengths. It does mean that there are a lot of questions, and in my experience, there was a fair bit of repetition as well. And that means that good preparation and chairing is essential. So Louise made sure that everyone prepared beforehand, and I backed that up, emphasising that I expected everyone to complete the score sheets themselves before the meeting so that we could really get the most, so that some thinking had been done before and we could get the most out of our time together. And then during the meetings, Louise made sure that we didn't get bogged down on questions that we didn't understand. We just moved on if we were stuck. And if conversations went off in interesting tangents, which is quite easy to do in this kind of environment, that those were given the right amount of airspace so that we can capture those ideas, but then bringing the conversation back and moving on to make sure we actually got through to the end of the context. I think it's important to point out, and this really goes back to what Alec said at the beginning about creating a digital strategy. The digital culture compass won't create your digital strategy for you. So it's a really useful tool, but it's not the whole. It's not the whole answer. So we're using the compass as part of a wider project. And the Compass report is just one of the pieces of research and analysis which will feed into our digital strategy and in turn into a more detailed digital action plan, both of which will mesh with our overarching organisational strategy and our overarching business plan. So the Compass won't give you all the answers, but it will help you make sure that you're asking all the right questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, both of you. That was, I mean, there was a huge amount of really helpful information in what you were just saying. And Vicky, particularly what were you saying about almost you don't know what you don't know? I thought that was really interesting when you were mentioning the accessibility work that you've been doing, and I think that's a really key point about the compass in general, is that it's quite a daunting tool, but it does give you that opportunity to understand the wider context of digital and how it sort of is involved in all aspects of your work. And just because you're doing one area really well, and obviously for the Museum of Freemasonry that was marketing and communications, it doesn't mean that you can necessarily forget about other areas. And I think that's where the compass can be really useful in sort of understanding the context of digital and how it relates to everything that you do, as opposed to just sort of a few different aspects. The rest of the session, I think what we're going to do is, the rest of the session I think can be slightly directed by you all. So once you've completed the compass, or completed a section of the compass, you then get a report. And this report basically will either stay on the platform itself, or you can also, I forgot to tell them that I'm not a robot. So the reports will either stay on the dashboard that you've got, or they can you can export them as PDFs, and you can also export the data as Excels. So there you can see download as PDF, and you can share it through email and that sort of stuff. So this is just a summary for the marketing and communication section, which is the section that I've completed. So here you can see the blue represents where you're at the moment, and the green represents where you want to be in the future as percentages, which, you know, how helpful that is, also not equal percentages, so that's confusing, but anyway. You also then got a summary by capability, and the capabilities I think are actually quite important, because the compass asks these 3 questions throughout every activity area. So every activity area has, you know, 6 or so questions that are unique to that activity, but then every activity's last 3 questions will be accessibility, skills, and data. And then they're asking questions about how accessible that digital activity is for audiences and staff, etc. How the skills that your organization needs to achieve those activities, you know, match up, whether the skills are there or if you need to work more on improving the skills of your staff. And then data is looking at how you sort of like collect and analyze data based around those activities. And those 3 are consistent across every activity area. So again, you can then see like where you are for accessibility, where you are for skills, and where you are for data at the moment, and then where you'll be in the future once you've started completing it. In my fictional museum of Alec, I wanted to be, you know, super accessible. And particularly at the moment with all of the content that we're doing online, there are a lot of audiences that can't access that content for various different reasons. And making sure that your content is accessible as you can possibly make it is really important. So then you can also have a look at the full data. So again, you can sort of minimize and maximize activity areas. So if I'd done more activity areas, there'd be more there. But once I've maximized that, you can then look at each individual question. So here is what I was saying about skills, data, and accessibility. And again, if we have one of the other activity areas, skills, data, and accessibility will be there too. But if we just look at one of those questions, it gives you the overall information, like the stuff that you see when you complete the question. And then it gives you the scores for each one, how you're performing at the moment and how you're performing planning to perform in the next 12 months. And then this is the really important point that I was mentioning, the score notes. And again, like keeping accurate notes of how you're scoring things is really important. Definitely try to do it within the compass itself, because that's, the most likely place where all of the data and the information is going to be stored. But what Vicky was saying about how Louise was taking really good minutes during their meetings to go through the compass, I think that's really important as well. Like having a sort of like a record, either video, so if you record the Zoom session, or written if you write minutes of the conversations that people were having, can be really useful to refer back to. And theoretically, if you wanted to, you could then summarize those conversations, those ideas within the notes for both the current and the target, just so that you have that context when you come back to looking at it. And again, it's the same for each question. So there's nothing fancy about this. It doesn't necessarily give you, well, it does give you some bar charts, but how useful that is, I'm not entirely sure. I think the most useful thing is the scores that you're giving it and the notes that you're leaving yourself. I can quickly show you the PDF. Again, the PDF is pretty much the same thing, just like a collapsed version of it all. But it is quite handy that this is something that theoretically you could, save the PDF and send out to each member who took part, or send it to your board. So again, yeah, you got the different data for capabilities. And then as you scroll down, it starts talking about activity area, and it's basically just a collapsed version of the dashboard. But this is something that you could share these PDFs with members of your team who have taken part in the activity, without needing to share all of the login details and have the potential worry of them accidentally changing scores and that sort of stuff without you knowing.
Yeah. I mean, I circulated the report to everybody. And the bar chart thing is, I can see it being a useful visual thing for like sticking under the noses of board members and saying, this is where we are, this is where we want to be, and this is how big the gap is. So this is why we're suggesting investment in X, Y, and Z. It's a useful visual tool. But in terms of working out how you're going to bridge those gaps, that's for something else to do, not the compass itself.
Real. Yes, thank you very much. No, that's great. That's really useful context. And you're right that in general, numbers and pie charts and bar charts and that are really handy to just sort of shove under the faces of people who don't necessarily overly care, but are making the decisions. So it's handy to have. So yeah, that's the report. Kind of what you would expect from a report. It's not the fanciest thing in the world, but it can be a really useful representation of your work. I think the thing that I would say is don't try and do every single activity all at once. Focus on one or two activities, work through them either with yourself or as a group, and that's how you're going to get the full benefit of this toolkit. If you try to do it all at once, it's not going to be useful at all. And I think the thing that Vicky said in the case study, that completing the compass is just one step in a much broader range of work. I think I was having this discussion with one of the groups when we were in our breakout groups, but we were talking about the timing of all of this and whether now is a good time to do it when everybody's doing so much work. And in one sense, this is the perfect time to do it, as museums are moving a lot of their content online and are starting to do, more digital activities than they've done before. This is a really good opportunity to just sort of stop and take stock of what you're doing and to understand how effective, how efficient, how in line with your organization's mission everything that you're doing is at the moment. And it can also help you sort of like trim some of the stuff that maybe you started doing just because you thought we need to start making content, let's do these live streams, for instance. It could give you an opportunity to look at that and think to yourself, actually, these aren't that successful. Let's trim that off. But the video tutorials that we've been making for families, they've been really successful and they really, reach our target audience. So let's focus, no time on the live streams, but focus that energy into the stuff that is working. Those like YouTube videos, for instance, as an example. The one thing that I will say though is that I also fully understand that at the moment, everybody's hands on deck. There's a lot of people doing a lot of work, and there's a lot of people who may be the only person who isn't on furlough within their organization. So in the same breath, now might not be the right time to do this sort of work. So I think it's about understanding the context of your organization, knowing who needs to be part of these conversations. Like if you can get your directors and your trustees and that sort of stuff, fantastic. If you can't, maybe just an exercise for you to do, just to sort of take stock of all of the work that you're doing, that could be really useful too.
So I thought I'd end this video just with a little bit extra for you. I thought I'd discuss something that came up during the questions and the group discussion whilst we were talking during the breaks and that sort of stuff, was talking about how we could use the tracker as an organisation. And it is something that Louise covered in her excellent case study, as did Vicky. But I thought it'd be useful to just sort of talk through some tips for completing the tracker as an organisation now. At the moment, obviously, the majority of museums and heritage organisations, you're not going to be meeting in person. Ideally, this is an activity that is best done in person. I find that in-person meetings are often more productive. It's a lot easier to understand where people are coming from, what they're thinking about. But that's not to say that you can't do it over Zoom. So whether you're doing it in person or over Zoom, you want to be organising a meeting with a number of your colleagues from across all levels of the organisation. So from front of house staff to archives, to senior managers, trustees if you can, directors. Get a whole group of people all in the same place to discuss these digital activities. But before you actually run that meeting, you want to send out a few of the questions from the Culture Compass tracker, along with the Culture Compass tracker guidance in advance, so that people can answer those questions for the specific activity that you're going to be talking about in that meeting, so that they can then go to the meeting with ideas, with thoughts about the digital activities that they're undertaking from their own perspectives. And I think that's the key thing, is that this is a really good opportunity to get the perspective of different members of your organisation about how digital activities are used, how successful they are, where there's opportunities for improvement, where there's opportunities to perhaps stop doing some activities and introduce new ones. Getting those different perspectives. When you complete it on your own, you're very much looking at it through your lens, whereas when you do it as a group, you get the opportunity to understand how different people perceive digital within the organisation. So ask them to complete that section so that you can then discuss it in the meeting, and then during the meeting discuss the scorings that individuals gave and their reasonings behind those scores, again to get those different different perspectives on how digital is used within the organisation. And then during the meeting, you want to decide on an overall organisational score for those activity questions, and decide that as a group, so that you have, the group almost sign off on the scores that you give, as well as the scores that you're going to aim for the next 12 months. And then that's something that you can repeat for other relevant sections over the course of a few months. And then it's also something that you can repeat towards the end of the 12 months, or whatever period you decide to put on it, for you to improve your digital activities, and then see whether or not you were successful based on group feedback.
So I think that's enough from me. I've talked an awful lot. Here's my contact information. If you want to send me an email or anything like that, you've got my email address. I forgot that it's animated. There we go. If you want to send me an email, feel free. award@museumoflondon.org.uk, Twitter @themuseumguy. I'm also on LinkedIn. If anybody does LinkedIn, that is a thing that I am on.